Creighton was the ones that were really dictating, right? It felt like this Kansas offense was constantly rushed because they were concerned about falling behind, which obviously they did fall behind with what Creighton was doing. But it just never felt like KU was able to establish any sort of game rhythm, any sort of tempo, really on either end of the floor, to be quite honest with you.
Thanks for listening to KC Sports Network, proudly presented by Emprise Bank. If you're thinking about starting a business or know someone who is, check out Emprise Bank's SBA loans. It's always good to know your options, and they can be your partner in possible.
Paid all who enter. Beware this podcast. That's right, this is the Paid Podcast on the Kansas City Sports Network. I'm Nick Springer. I'm here with Kevin Flaherty. As always, we're brought to you by Emprise Bank, your partner in all things possible. Member FDIC. I am a proud account owner of Emprise Bank. Highly recommend them, so be sure to check them out as they support us here on the show. And Kevin, unfortunately, Kansas basketball drops their first game of the season on the road against Creighton. Their first true road game, by the way, 76-63. We're going to be diving into that, talking some KU Missouri, as well as Kansas will have another true road game coming up this weekend on Sunday afternoon in Columbia for the Border War. Going to get all into that. Also got a little bit of football talk here coming up at the end of the episode. I did want to kick things off real quick on the football side by just making a couple quick notes. Number one, Logan Brown has declared for the NFL draft. And I just want to say this about that. Anytime a guy declares for the NFL draft when he could come back, it's a good thing for a program because that means you're going to have a player playing at the next level, which is huge for, the future, right? I think Logan Brown is a player that KU fans would obviously love to have back. I dealt with some injuries while at KU, had a strong season this year, but he has decided to declare for the NFL draft. So that's now Kansas losing another starter on their offensive line. And then in the secondary, they have two defensive backs that have declared for the transfer portal, which is Caleb Purdy and Brian Dilworth. We talked about the youth that they have in the secondary, but all of a sudden with two corners transferring, that probably takes the cornerback position up a notch in terms of priority in the transfer portal for Kansas. The transfer portal opens on December 9th, by the way. So all this news you're seeing of players entering the transfer portal, it's all just basically them saying they're going to. They won't actually do it until December 9th. That is when it opens up. Obviously, Kansas will be very busy, and we'll be talking about that tons more here on the show throughout this offseason as Kansas looks to sort of restock the cupboard for their roster heading into 2025. Okay, like I said, we'll get into a little bit more football discussion later on in the show, but obviously the headline of today's show is KU basketball going on the road to take on the Creighton Blue Jays. Creighton had been really struggling, dropped a couple games earlier last week. This was part of the Big 12 Big East Challenge for KU taking on Creighton, and it was just an unfortunate game for Kansas. I mean, it's in a lot of ways, it was the classic Kansas loss. You had an All-American caliber big man in Ryan Kalkbrenner, who was a game-time decision, and he just comes out and is like sprinting around, dunking, and doing all kinds of crazy stuff that you wouldn't expect a guy who's game-time decision to be doing. And then, of course, old friend alert, Pop Isaacs from Texas Tech also finds his way onto Creighton, and he goes off for them as well. Kansas loses 76-63. Kevin, first true road game of the season for KU without Rylan Griffin, who we learned was dealing with an illness. I mean, is there anything really to take away from this game? Are you concerned at all, I guess, from a loss like this in early December in their first true road game?
Not necessarily concerned. It's always interesting. I think, Twitter is so reactionary, and a lot of us have that app open while we're watching games. And so people are saying, oh, this is going to come back to haunt them. This is the same thing people did to him last year, all of these things, and want to make sort of these sweeping conclusions. Look, it was a combination of two things, Nick. Pop Isaacs is a guy that can shoot you into a game, and he can shoot you out of a game. He absolutely shot them into the game. He was really, really hot. Some of those were open looks. Some of them weren't. And credit to him. He's always been a guy that can make a tough shot. That's part of his appeal. I think Kalkbrenner's a heck of a player when he's healthy and really gives them an extra element, does a lot for them defensively. At the same time, you couldn't help but I kind of smirked maybe a little bit when you said Kansas dropped this game, because there are a lot of things that made you feel like this was a little bit of a fumble from Kansas's point of view. And offensively, took care of the ball really well in one aspect, right? Not turning the ball over. That's the most basic definition of taking care of the ball. Did not take care of the ball in another aspect, and that's working to get the shots that you want to get. And I think obviously nobody wants to have games where DeJuan Harris is shooting that much, probably least of all DeJuan Harris. Obviously, when you have Hunter Dickinson getting 4 shot attempts, 2 of which were inside the arc, the other 2 were outside the arc, and then KJ Adams was getting some looks that weren't really going down either. And I think as the game progressed, Kansas would make a run, get it down to 3 or 5, and you'd say, okay, here it is. And then the defense maybe would allow a bucket. The offense would have a bad possession where somebody would take a step back 18-footer, or so you would have a shot attempt that you didn't necessarily want, and it would stretch back out. And I think that's one of the things you can take away from this is you've got to value those possessions in close games. Yes, Creighton had points in the game where they were really shooting lights out, wound up hitting 12 threes, I think shooting like 41% from 3. So it was a good shooting day, but not necessarily a we cannot win this game because of the way the other team is shooting type of good day. And so in those situations, you kind of just have to keep a steady ship. And I think defensively, there were some letdowns we talked about with the North Carolina game, right? Where we said that Kansas misses Shaq Moore in this game because KU did not have enough guards to match up defensively with North Carolina. You take Rylan Griffin out, and that number is subtracted even one more. And so I do think defensively, where you would have liked to actually have some guys that are quote unquote coolers, that you could put them on somebody that's hot and really make them work for it and slow somebody down. Kansas didn't have as many options from that standpoint. I really just think Kansas had to take better care of the ball in terms of getting more quality shots. And defensively, I think, is where you really saw the absence sort of hurt them because they didn't have as many guys that Self could just put in and say, hey, Rylan, just make Pop Isaacs work for everything, where he's not going 6 for 7 from 3. Maybe he's going 4 for 7 from 3 and you're 6 points closer. And so I do think that Griffin's absence was missed. The other thing too, Nick, I think Kansas, I get why Kansas is blitzing ball screens right now, and it was something that was very effective against Duke. I get why you would do it against Creighton because you don't want Stephen Ashworth, a guy who was a really good player at, I think, Utah State, right?
Yeah, Utah State.
Yeah, where he came over to Creighton, really good shooter. You don't want Stephen Ashworth coming off of a pick clean and being in rhythm and knocking down shots. I think Kansas has a decision to make when Hunter Dickinson is in the ball game, and that's, can you afford to have him blitz those screens? And if you do, you really need the rotation behind him to be outstanding too, to where you're not getting beat on the back end of that, because it's going to take him a little while to rally back to the basket. Or is it the sort of thing where you say, hey, with Udoka Azubuike, we played a lot of drop. With David McCormick, it was a lot of drop. And so is there a point where you look at this thing with Hunter Dickinson and say, as much as it would be ideal to be able to blitz those ball screens, and maybe that's something you could still do with Flory, maybe it's something where you're having to say, okay, this is the point of no return for Hunter Dickinson in terms of how high he goes up. And you just tell your guards, you know what, you have to fight over that screen and make things difficult, because we're not going to keep putting our defense into a spot where people can attack us and pick and roll on the back end of that.
Well, and look, we knew about Rylan Griffin with the illness, and I mean, we don't know it really beyond that, but the way Hunter Dickinson looked on the court, it didn't appear as if maybe he was at full strength, right? Sure. I mean, he was pretty lethargic, I thought, at times. Only got 4 shots, right? I mean, this is a game where, with Ryan Kalkbrenner being a game time decision, you would circle Hunter Dickinson and say, okay, this is what we're going to do. We're going to get Hunter Dickinson the ball and try to exploit that. And instead, that didn't really happen at all. Hunter Dickinson didn't even really attempt to post up until almost 12 minutes into the first half. They didn't even really try to do that. And look, Creighton was doubling right away when the few times that they did try to do it. And Creighton, I think, had a pretty clear strategy of kind of cramming inside and trying to see if a guy like Dajuan Harris or KJ Adams could beat them. So I do want to give some credit to Creighton there, but you do have to wonder a little bit about Hunter Dickinson because only 4 shot attempts. He looked a little bit slow. I don't know. Maybe the flu was kind of going around in that locker room a little bit. I guess we might find out from Bill Self a little bit more about that. But that was something that was noteworthy, certainly, with kind of the way that he played and the way that KU was playing. And kind of along tangentially related to that, Kevin, to me, one of the big takeaways from this game was the fact that I felt like for a really significant majority of the game, it was Creighton that was dictating the pace. It was Creighton that was dictating the tempo. It was Creighton that was sort of the ones, acting as the maestros of the game, so to speak, in terms of that aspect of it. So that's not something you typically see often from a Bill Self-coached team where they just let the opponent dictate to them for 30 plus minutes, really. I mean, Kansas had that hot start to the second half. That was really the only time I think where it felt like they were in control of the game tempo-wise, but Creighton was the ones that were really dictating, right? It felt like this Kansas offense was constantly rushed because they were concerned about falling behind, which obviously they did fall behind with what Creighton was doing. But it just never felt like KU was able to establish any sort of game rhythm, any sort of tempo, really on either end of the floor, to be quite honest with you. But obviously, it's much more noticeable on the offensive end of the floor when you're unable to really dictate that. And as a result, we saw, Dajuan Harris driving and sort of putting up, soft floaters, rim runners off the glass, just kind of shots that you wouldn't expect Kansas to take. And then certainly as the lead kind of got bigger down the stretch in the second half, it just turned into almost a pickup game where Kansas just went down and the first guy that got the ball shot it. And that was not a recipe for success for Kansas. They kind of crumbled down the stretch. So that was kind of my big takeaway was Creighton pretty much from the get-go was the team that felt like they were more in control, that felt like they were controlling the tempo of the game. And as a result, Kansas was uncomfortable for basically 35 plus minutes of the game, really. And that really, really seemed to sort of stymie them and not allow them to get anything going offensively. And look, on top of that, I mean, the shots just weren't falling also. Kansas at the rim especially was really struggling. KJ Adams missed some layups. AJ Storr had a couple nice drives where he couldn't finish. Even Dajuan Harris, when he had open layup looks, they weren't really getting him to go. So that was part of it too. Kansas just wasn't hitting shots, right? But that's obviously not something you want to say when your team loses is, oh, well, we just didn't hit shots. That's not something that really rings very well with fans and whatnot. But that I think was part of it. But yeah, to me, certainly it was the tempo aspect. It was the fact that Creighton from the get-go really felt like they were the team that was controlling the flow of the game and not allowing Kansas to really get anything going.
Yeah, Kansas played Creighton's game. I mean, that's a great point. Yeah, I mean, exactly. That's exactly what it was. And it's interesting because it felt like Creighton had an unbelievable offensive day. And to be fair, when they took shots, they mostly Kansas did a really good job of forcing turnovers out there. I mean, Ashworth, I think, had 6 maybe, and Isaacs had 5. So, I mean, you did a pretty good job of getting after that backcourt. But overall, with the turnovers in, Creighton averaged 1.09 points per possession. North Carolina averaged 1.16, and KU won that game. And I'm not saying that was ideal. Obviously, we were all watching the North Carolina game. We're like, what is this defense? When are they going to get a stop? But in all seriousness, I do think your point's a really good one because not only did Creighton control the tempo, but Creighton kind of controlled the game in terms of the guys that Creighton wanted to take the shots for Kansas were the guys taking the shots. And so I don't have a problem with, say, Dajuan Harris going 3 for 9 from 3, right? A 33% 3-point shooter. That's essentially Division I average. That's not what loses you the game. When you're going inside the arc, as Dajuan Harris did so often in that game, what do you wind up with? I think 12 attempts inside the arc. Yeah. He went 3 for 12 inside the arc. And to your point, some of those were layups where you felt pretty good about that shot. Some of them were floaters where it's like, well, this isn't an ideal, shot this possession, but Kansas was having guys take shots where I think Creighton was kind of like, that's okay. I didn't think, Zeke Mayo took some good looks, but when they were trying to come back, there was like a step back 18-footer in there that one great look. A couple of the Coit looks were kind of like, okay, that's kind of a heat check look. That's not what we do in this situation, but all of that feeds into your greater point where it's like, if Creighton could have drawn the game up and said, here are our guys, this is the tempo we want to play at, here are our guys we want shooting the ball, here are the guys we want shooting the ball for Kansas, it played out pretty much entirely true to formula for Creighton in that game.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more with that. And listen, the other aspect of this that I was really keeping an eye on was this was Kansas's first true road game. Kind of mentioned it up the top. And so I was really interested to see, especially how Kansas's freshmen would perform in this game. And unfortunately, Marquise Passmore and Floyd Badunga did not really handle the environment that well. Passmore played a little bit early on and then got him a little bit later in the game, but ended up shooting 0 of 1 from the field, and he missed it. It was a 3-point shot he missed. He had 3 fouls in the span of like 4 minutes also, which was not great. And then Floyd Badunga also ended up playing 13 minutes. He did grab 5 rebounds and had a dunk in there off of it was sort of a botched play by KJ Adams, I think, where it just like randomly came to Badunga underneath the basket for a dunk. So that was his only points of the game. So I don't know.
One of the few positives, though. Zach Clemens' minute. Zach Clemens came in, and especially for how Zach had played kind of coming into that game, where you had a couple good moments, but you had also had some stuff where it's like, man, Zach's been here a while. You should do a little bit better in that situation. Zach Clemens had some great minutes, I thought, and really impacted the game. He was in there in a positive way. And if he could become another depth piece that when everybody is, no longer ill, when Shaq Moore is healthy, that just makes this roster so much deeper. If you feel like, hey, at the second round NCAA tournament game, we need somebody to come in this situation, and you can trust Zach Clemens in that situation, that makes this team that much tougher.
Yeah, it was early in the second half. KJ Adams picked up his 3rd foul, and Zach Clemens came in, and it was kind of like oh boy. And it was when Creighton was starting to sort of regain control of the game a little bit. And with Zach Clemens on the floor, KU actually cut into the lead. I think he came in, they were down 10, and they were down 6, I think, by the time he left the game again. So he had a really positive stretch there when KU really needed it.
Had 4 points, had a couple steals in there, grabbed a rebound.
Really nice. Yeah, really nice plays.
He's done a couple nice things defensively, I want to say, over the last few games. And so, Bill Self, if you're doing something defensively, then when he looks over to that bench to see who's going to come into the ball game, his eyesight kind of hones in on you a little bit more. And so I'll be interested to see whether he can parlay this into more minutes.
Yeah, and you touched on Zeke Mayo, and Zeke Mayo had a couple of really clutch shots for KU. Overall, I don't know that he really probably played one of his best games, but he hit a couple of really clutch shots. And I think that's the type of role that we can expect from Zeke Mayo going forward. Like he definitely seems like he has that sort of clutch factor in him to hit some big shots, hit a couple of big threes in the game, ended up going 2 of 4 from 3. Kansas, by the way, ended up attempting 23 threes. I know people get fixated on what attempts Kansas had. They attempted 23, but of course, they attempted 23 with DeJuan Harris shooting 9 of those, which is probably not what you really want going forward.
They did hit 8, in fairness, which was right around 35%. So it's not bad. It's not a bad day at the office. It's not where you would like it to be, but it's not one of those like 3 for 23 days where you're like, why do you keep shooting? And so I did think beyond the arc they did okay. I think it did feel like they got a lot of threes right when the game was bordering on catastrophic. Like Creighton would get up to 10 or 13 and you're like, oh my gosh, are they going to put this to 20? And then a guy would make a 3 and KU would kind of hang around. And for the final scoreline, obviously Creighton lands that double-digit win. I do think Kansas hung around maybe a little bit more than the scoreline would indicate. Not that that's something you take away as a giant positive is, hey, we entered as the number one team, and Spike Ollie, we were in the game. But I did think, Kansas had its opportunities. When that thing got to 3, when it got to 5, there were some chances in there for Kansas to sort of take that next step, potentially tie the game, really put a lot of pressure on Creighton. Those plays just didn't happen. And to your point, sort of right when we started, I do think that when we're looking at this team in February, the closers offensively are going to be Zeke Mayo and Hunter Dickinson.
Yeah. And look, I mean, we talked about Creighton. I wasn't overly impressed with what Creighton was doing, to be quite honest with you. Like, obviously, Pop Isaacs came in as a 33% 3-point shooter this season to start the year. And he, goes off and is 6 of 7 at one point, basically. And Kalkbrenner ends up being effective. But like, overall, I was not very overly impressed with what Creighton was doing. It was basically a flurry of points to start the game for Creighton. And then they were able, the one impressive thing that Creighton did do was when Kansas started the second half on that 7-0 run, Creighton responded very quickly.
Yes.
Which that was probably the turning point in the game, or one of the major turning points in the game. But beyond that, like, it was just a flurry of 3-point shots and then a lot of kind of nothing 3-point shots, nothing 3-point shots. Like, that was kind of what Creighton did. So I was not overly impressed with Creighton. I think that KU struggled without Rylan Griffin. They struggled. They still without Shaq Moore. I'd love to see what Shaq Moore can do on the floor. Also, yeah. I know you're really high on him, and I'd love to see what he can do. Also,
he's a terrific defender, and I do think there's a little bit more offensively in that chest that hasn't been opened just yet because he played at Mississippi State. And I don't know how many of our watchers watch a lot of Mississippi State. Unfortunately, being a former national college basketball writer, I had to watch a lot of everybody, and watching Mississippi State was a lot like having your best friend punch you in the groin for 2 hours.
Hey, Mississippi State, by the way, got a huge win last night.
They are great defensively, but like that's how they win. Their games are just absolutely, mud and rock fights, and are not fun. They don't run a whole lot offensively. The stuff they do run, I'm not sure they've practiced before. Like Chris Jans as a coach, he wins at a really high level. Was at New Mexico State, and they won 80 bajillion games before he got to Mississippi State. But my general point just being Shaq Moore, his offensive success that he had at Mississippi State was probably in spite of being at Mississippi State rather than because of what they were doing at Mississippi State. So,
by the way, just a quick little note here before we go to break, the SEC, Kevin, absolutely destroy the
hammered.
I think Duke was the only win, right, for ACC. I think that was it.
I think they got 2 because Clemson beat Kentucky.
Oh, okay. Clemson beat Kentucky. Okay, yeah, you're right. I'm looking at it now, yeah. But, I mean, they just got absolutely dominated. I mean, Alabama goes into North Carolina's home court and dominates them. Florida dominates Virginia. We just mentioned Mississippi State. They ended up beating Pittsburgh by 33.
Good.
So, just a tough performance from the ACC in that challenge. By the way, the Big 12 didn't really fare that well against the Big East either. Yeah. In terms of the Big 12 a Big East challenge. With Baylor losing, Kansas obviously, Iowa State did get a win over Marquette, even though it looked like Iowa State was going to lose. Villanova beat Cincinnati, so yeah,
that was shocking to me. Because I like that Cincinnati team, and I think Villanova is not super great. So that's the nice way to put it. And so I was surprised by that one. The UConn one to me doesn't mean anything because UConn was without one of its top players. Baylor was without VJ Edgecombe. And so it was kind of like, well, okay, like whoever wins this game wins it, but I'm not drawing any long-term conclusions from this.
I mean, I'll just say this about that game.
For New York, or for UConn.
Yeah, I will say this about that game. That game was sort of like a over my dead body game for UConn, right?
Yeah.
They absolutely had to win that game.
Yes.
So that's what I'll say about that one, really. That's all I've got on that. Listen, win or lose for Kansas, you can always look good with home field apparel. I'm rocking the Payheed shirt here on the pod today. So head over to homefieldapparel.com. If you missed out on the Black Friday sale for the holidays, don't worry. You can still use the promo code Payheed24 for 15% off your first order over at homefieldapparel.com. If you're looking for any last-minute, really quality gifts, possibly for the holidays, for Christmas, you can shop Kansas. If you got a family, friend, or relative who is a fan of another school, Homefield's got you covered. 130-plus schools. They just recently released also some embroidered oh my gosh, what do they call those? The quarter zips.
Yeah.
Quarter zips, I was thinking of. They just released some quarter zips also on Home Field Apparel, so you can check those out.
Here's my money.
Exactly. That's promo code PAID24, 15% off your first order. It's a quick turnaround for Kansas. They're going to be taking on Missouri in the Border War. We're going to talk a little bit about that coming up next.
Looking for tickets for your next event? Tickets for Less is your number one source. Save big on every purchase when you use promo code KCSN at ticketsforless.com.
This is the Payheed Podcast on the Kansas City Sports Network. I'm Nick Springer. I'm here with Kevin Flaherty. We are brought to you by Emprise Bank, your partner in all things possible, member FDIC. If you like what you're hearing, you can subscribe. If you like what you're watching, if you're watching us on YouTube, be sure to subscribe, like the show, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment to share your thoughts on anything, really. I mean, we talk KU on the show, obviously, but we will talk anything. Kevin and I will talk anything you want. We spent about an hour talking about Mass Effect one time. That was awesome. Anything you want, you can drop a comment and share your thoughts on it here on the channel. And be sure to subscribe, tell your friends about us, so on and so forth. And also, by the way, Kevin and Ryan Wallace did a great job covering National Signing Day for KU. So if you're on the KU YouTube channel, you want to check out the Verbal Equipment show that they put out earlier this week, covering all things KU football on National Signing Day on the high school side for Kansas. KU signed 15 recruits, and pretty exciting stuff over there. So be sure to check out that show as well to get up to date on the latest Kansas high school football recruiting as well. Okay, so it's a quick turnaround for Kansas basketball, Kevin, after the loss against Creighton. They're going to be going to Columbia to take on the Missouri Tigers on Sunday afternoon at, what do they call their arena? Is it just Mizzou Arena? Do they just call it that?
Yep. Yeah.
Wow. That is so lame. That is incredibly lame.
Well, when they named it after Paige, and then she wound up getting in trouble for plagiarism or whatever it was. They kind of
didn't even know that.
Yeah, there's some fun stuff in there. So.
Well, that sucks, Missouri. So that's where they're going to be going. That's where KU's going to go on Sunday afternoon to take on Missouri. And look, Missouri was arguably the worst Power 4 team in college basketball. Probably the worst. I don't even know if it was really arguable. The worst Power 4 team in college basketball last season. They went 0-18 in SEC play. They were terrible last year down the stretch. This year, they're sitting at 7-1. They went in the transfer portal. The beauty of being really, really bad in college athletics, and especially in college basketball, this era, is that you can get good quickly if you're able to go into the transfer portal and add some guys. And that's what Missouri did. They went out and got a couple guys. Got a Duke transfer in Mark Mitchell, who's been one of their leading scorers so far this season.
Kansas State did Bishop Miege, yeah.
Yep, that's true. With Mark Mitchell, they also got a transfer from Northern Kentucky in Josh Gray, who's a 7-footer, who's been their starting big man. Tamar Bates is a really quality player that's been in their program for a while. They've got a sophomore, Anthony Robinson, who's stepped up and has been playing pretty well for them lately as well. But the reality is they haven't really played anybody. Their toughest opponent by far was Memphis, who they opened the season with, and it was actually a close game. They ended up losing that game by 8 points. Since then, Kevin, I'm just going to run you through the KenPom ratings of the opponents that Mizzou has played. Howard, who is 273. Eastern Washington, who is 239. Mississippi Valley State, who is literally the worst team in college basketball, 364. Pacific at 257. Arkansas Pine Bluff, who is the third worst team in college basketball, 362. Lindenwood, who is at 351 in KenPom. And then their most recent victory was a 98-93 win over California, who is 114 in KenPom. So they do have a night.
That's like a ranked win right there. Compared with by the way, the Valley State did get a second win this season playing at Oakwood, which I've never heard of Oakwood. I don't know if it's Division II, Division III, NAIA.
Kevin, I think
they are not a division. team, and they did defeat Oakwood. So shout out Mississippi Valley State getting that second win of the season.
I think Oakwood is what I have on my hardwood floors in my kitchen.
Dude, see what you did there. You know, their other win came against Mississippi University for women.
Yes, that's correct. Yes.
That's probably there.
Listen, if you want to go down a rabbit hole on that, the Mississippi University for Women has tried to change its name to something else, I think, like multiple times, and it keeps getting rejected.
Well, it started off, and keep in mind, it's Mississippi. Like, it started off being Mississippi College for whatever and Education of White Women was like the name of the school. So
yeah, they definitely need to change that.
Yeah, so they've needed the name change a few times now, Nick, but they've only had men's sports here for it's less than 10 years. I know, especially on basketball, because they got men's sports, and then I think the second year they got men's sports was when basketball for them. So, and that was like 2018, 2019, something like that. So Mississippi University for Women, not a deep men's basketball history if you're looking into it.
Hey, and also shout out to Mississippi Valley State for keeping it kind of close against Kansas State for a little bit when they played in Manhattan also. So yeah, that's what you're looking at with Missouri is they have really hardly played anybody in their non-conference schedule. Kansas will be by far their toughest test in the non-con. They do also have Illinois on their schedule, which is another rivalry for them later on in December. And so when you look at this Missouri team, Kevin, they have been absolutely incredibly effective offensively. That's really been what they've done so well so far this season. But again, taking it with a grain of salt, considering the level of opponent they played. But even still, to have the number one field goal percentage in the country in 2-point shots is still very impressive, regardless of your level of opponent.
Well, they attack the basket really well. And you've seen that not just in the 2-point field goal percentage that you're talking about, but they're also, if I remember right, like top 5 in the country in free throw rate. They get to the line a ton. Yeah, they're number 2.
Number 2. Yep.
Yeah, and so they get to the free throw line a ton. And so when you look at it, and they don't necessarily, a lot of teams that get to the free throw line a lot, big men shooting a lot of free throws or whatever else. With Missouri, you know, Anthony Robinson gets to the line a ton. I mean, Tony Perkins gets to the line right now a ton. He's only played in 6 of their games, but his percentages in terms of getting to the line are a whole bunch. And so they do a really good job of getting their backcourt guys going downhill to the rim, and they've shot well at the rim. But the other part of that, Nick, is they're getting extra shots at the free throw line too. So that hasn't hurt them at all.
Yeah. And then one other quick note on their personnel: Caleb Grill, who is pride of Mays High, by the way. I don't know if you're aware of that, Kevin.
He thought you were the pride of Mays High.
Well, yes, of course. Obviously, I'm
is the second pride.
The second most notable Mays High alum. He had been Missouri's leading scorer until he suffered a neck injury. Didn't play in the game against Cal. I'm unclear of his status, whether or not he'll be available to play for them against Kansas on Sunday. But that's something else to keep in mind, and just in terms of their personnel. But yeah, in terms of the players to watch, I mean, Mark Mitchell obviously is a Duke transfer. Mentioned him. Tamar Bates has been really good. And then Anthony Robinson had 29 for Missouri in their win against Cal. So he's a guy that is capable of being an explosive scorer, which, by the way, kind of to hammer home your point on the free throw shooting, Robinson, 13 of 15 from the free throw line.
Yep.
So he got 13 of his 29 points at the free throw line in the win against Cal. And Missouri shot 38 free throws as a team in that game compared to just 25 for Cal. And that's also coming for Kansas. They're coming off a game against Creighton in which they only attempted 8 free throws the whole game. So that could be something to keep an eye on, right? If Missouri is able to get to the free throw line a lot and maybe make that gap wide, that could be something to keep an eye on.
Yeah, I think so. And the other thing is we've seen Kansas struggle with some of its lineups right now when certain guys are getting into foul trouble. And so if Missouri is attacking the paint and getting downhill, and you're having to sit down KJ Adams, or, you know, you're having to sit down Hunter Dickinson, those are spots where you're having to potentially have Flory Badunga out there. and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but he can pick up fouls pretty quickly too, as we've seen. So this could be one of those games where you really have to defend well on the perimeter to make sure you're not putting big men in bad situations where they can get into foul trouble, because I think that's where you start to get into trouble potentially in this one is, hey, if you've got a big man or two that has to sit, they're not going to stop attacking the basket when those guys are out. And so I think that's kind of the key to a Missouri keeping this thing close, potentially competing in this thing is really getting downhill and trying to put Kansas's big men in compromising situations.
Yeah, and look, that kind of goes back to something I mentioned with the Creighton game, which is that was the first road game for Floyd Dunga and Rockies Passmore, and this will be their second, and it's going to be potentially the most hostile environment they will see all season, to be honest, with what Missouri is going to be probably bringing to the table in this game. So that's something else I'm going to be continuing to monitor, right, is how do those guys sort of react to that, because they didn't necessarily handle the Creighton atmosphere very well, and Missouri's atmosphere, obviously, or anticipate is going to be, again, maybe one of the toughest KU we'll see all season, to be honest.
Yeah, and sometimes that helps, right? Like sometimes there are guys that really get up for playing on the road in those situations. You know, Hunter Dickinson's a guy that doesn't have any issues, wearing the black hat and getting booed. But you saw Kansas a couple years ago take a national championship team into Columbia, and really, like, from the get-go, they came out and it was very clear that they were fired up to be there. And last year's game against Missouri was at Allen Fieldhouse. You're at home. You're thinking, hey, you're going to have the home crowd. And Kansas kind of had a low-energy effort in that one for the most part. There were some moments like the KJ Adams block that we all remember, the chase out. But at the same time, overall, it was hardly a classic performance for that team. I think they saw that Missouri was struggling. They didn't seem fully into it. In this case, coming off of a loss, heading into that atmosphere, if Kansas, and I'm knocking on wood, if Kansas can shake this flu thing off to where everybody is healthy from an illness standpoint, I wouldn't be a bit surprised to see Kansas respond really well to this one and respond to the environment.
Yeah, and this will obviously be a big one for DeJuan Harris as well, right?
Yeah.
Being from that area and then going back for the final time in his college career with the Crimson and Blue with Kansas. So he's another player probably to watch in this game as well. And yeah, certainly we hope Rylan Griffin will get back. We've talked about Shaq Moore a little bit on this pod today, and one thing I wanted to kind of ask you is, like, is there a point where we should become a little more concerned about the injury that he's dealing with? In that it seemed like in the offseason he was ahead of schedule in terms of being able to come back and play. He then comes back and plays in one game, and then now he's been unable to play again. I mean, obviously off the heels of the Kevin McCullough injury situation that KU dealt with for a good chunk of last season, like, obviously Shaq Moore don't anticipate would be like that level of a player that KU could miss, but still he's a guy that I think you and I both agree could certainly add a lot to the team.
Yeah.
Is there a point where we should become any little more concerned about the situation at all?
Well, and we talk football on this show too, and I think Jalen Daniels a year ago, there were times where you would talk to somebody and they would feel like, hey, Jalen's got a chance to be back in a week or two, and it didn't work out that way. And so I do think there's not necessarily a date. Like, I know you said at what point, like, it's not like I'm looking at it like, hey, January 15th, I am officially worried. But at the same time, I do think that there's a point that you probably reach where you're starting to get too deep into conference play. Maybe if there hasn't been a return or a successful return at that point, where you're not necessarily saying, hey, he can't get healthy, but you're starting to wonder, is he going to have enough time to get healthy and get acclimated to playing at the highest level before the NCAA tournament? And I think for me, that's kind of where you circle it, where you're starting to get into February, where you're saying, hey, if he comes back tomorrow, is he even going to be ready in time for the role that Kansas is going to need him to play from a basketball standpoint? And so I think that's, for me at least, that's when I worry. How about you?
Well, look, I know I'm kind of the one that posed the question, but to sort of play devil's advocate to my own question here, you look at KU's schedule, you're coming up on having you're going to have a decent break in between games for over Christmas before you really have to ramp things up in conference play. So it's kind of a situation where I don't really know from the Kansas perspective if there should be a big rush to get him back, right now, because you're going to be entering into the stretch where, you're going to play a game against Missouri on Sunday, then you don't have another game until the following Saturday, then you have another 8 days until your next game, and then you have 9 days from your game against Brown on December 22nd to opening conference play on New Year's Eve against West Virginia. So it's like, I don't think that there's really a rush to get him back, right? Like, you don't want to get him back at full strength, and you're going to have a lot of time in between games to get a lot of practices in. I think a lot of times when you are playing games consecutively, you're playing a lot of games, especially once you get to conference play, right? Like, the practices are probably not really that heavily focused on what you're doing, right? Or like what, you know what I mean? So this would be the time where maybe if you could get him back to integrate him into practices, this is the time you would want to do it. So
yeah,
I know
I just kind of agreed. My thing is, if it goes into conference play and the Big 12 is the murderer's row that a lot of us think that it could be, and we've seen West Virginia have big wins. We've seen UCF, have big wins. This is a deep conference. At what point can he make it back? And also the other part of it is if it's February and Kansas is chasing a potential Big 12 title, is there an onus for Bill Self, even if Shaq Moore is healthy, to kind of put him out there in close games to say, hey, we're going to need this guy in March? Or is it the sort of thing where he's saying, no, like we got to have our guys in this situation? And so can he sort of punch through that to get in there too? Because if if he comes back, let's say for February 1st, well, okay, you're at Baylor, then you have Iowa State at home, then you go to K-State. It's not like there's a ton of minutes necessarily where you're just like, congrats on being back from the injury, go play 15 minutes today.
Yeah. Overall, how are you feeling about this? I mean, you kind of touched on it a little bit. Yeah, I think it seems like you're expecting Kansas to bounce back in this one, right? Against Missouri.
Yeah, I do. I do. I think it's, for Missouri, it's kind of the worst combination you want, right? Like, in terms of Kansas coming off a loss where not just losing, but one where you didn't play well, one where the coaches turn on that tape and, show you, hey, you didn't do well here. You didn't do the right thing here. And so I think whoever came after that Creighton game was probably going to get a lot of Kansas focus. I think the atmosphere is going to be great. And I think that because of that atmosphere, you're going to really have something that's going to make sure that KU doesn't sleepwalk through this one. And so I think Missouri is going to get Kansas's full attention. And so I do think that Kansas is going to bounce back. I'm not saying Missouri can't cause problems for Kansas in this game, because like we talked about, if you're getting downhill, Kansas's guards at times haven't done a great job defending that stuff. And if they're putting fouls on your big guys, there's a window here for Missouri that you can see where it's, hey, this is how Missouri is maybe going to butter its bread in this game. But ultimately, I do think that Kansas is going to be into this one. How about you?
Yeah, I agree with you. I think for a lot of the reasons you outlined, I mean, Missouri's atmosphere is going to be turned up, and I think that probably is going to actually help energize Kansas too. So that should be something to keep an eye on as well. I'm expecting DeJuan Harris to really put on a show with this being his last chance to play against Missouri in Columbia in his college career. So I think Kansas should and definitely will bounce back. Again, I mentioned it, Missouri, one of the worst teams in Power 4 last year, and while they are 7-1, talked about it, they haven't really played anybody. I think Kansas should be in a position to take care of business here. Okay, before we wrap things up here on the show, Kevin, it kind of teased it earlier on at the beginning of the show with football. Talked a little bit about some of the updates in the transfer portal, which, by the way, breaking news as we are recording. We're recording this on Tuesday afternoon. Literally as we are recording this, breaking news is that Deshaun Warner is going to be entering the transfer portal. DJ Warner entering the portal for Kansas. One of their top-ranked recruits, played quite a bit early in the year as a true freshman for Kansas at the defensive end position. That's a pretty big loss, I would say, for KU. Is he was, again, one of the top recruits for KU in this previous high school class. Really, really talented player, a guy that, we were both very, very high on. Got to see him play a bit this season as a true freshman, but he's decided to enter the transfer portal. Obviously, this is breaking news as it's happening, Kevin. So I don't know if you have any quick thoughts on sort of what that could mean or how that might impact KU.
Yeah, highest ranked guy that Kansas has signed in the recruiting database era. And so I think that part definitely stings, obviously. And DJ has a lot of potential. He's an excellent athlete. It felt like this year, when he was out there, he was not super proactive. He was kind of reacting to a lot of what happened. You didn't see the high level athleticism that he has. You didn't see him really being able to apply that just yet. And heading into this next season where Kansas is, making a lot of changes defensively, you have a lot of guys graduating and all of those. Kansas has a pretty good defensive end group in terms of talent. You were hoping the DJ would be able to tap into that talent and this next year really make a leap and become an absolute dude on the other side of this. So that stings because, I like DJ as a kid. I think in addition to that, I think DJ's talent was pretty special. He didn't get a chance to show a lot of that this year for one reason or another, despite the fact he was on the field. I do think Kansas has some other guys at that spot. When you look at Dylan Brooks potentially returning from injury, when you look at Bai Jobe, who actually got more snaps than DJ Warner in that finale against Baylor, another really highly rated guy, albeit one that KU got from the transfer portal, another young guy. You got Dak Brinkley, who sat through this season, but is another guy that was ranked as a 4-star prospect. Kansas yesterday signs Adrian Hawley, who was a 4-star prospect at the defensive end spot. And so this is a spot, Nick, where Kansas has not just quite a bit of talent, but a lot of young talent. And while you were hoping the DJ would kind of push through all of that and become the guy, Kansas does have some other guys that could be at that position there. The other thing, Nick, is DJ's a weak side defensive end, at least theoretically right now. I hesitate to say anybody's coming back because it's transfer portal season. But theoretically, you're bringing back Dean Miller at that weak side spot along with the young guys. What you really need is somebody to emerge at that strong side end spot. And so looking at all of that, like I said, it's not that this isn't a loss, but this is a position where Kansas does have quite a bit of young talent.
Yeah, speaking of the defensive end and speaking of Dean Miller, that gives us a good opportunity to transition into the all Big 12 announcements, which came out earlier on Tuesday as well. Dean Miller was on that list, Kevin. Dean Miller was all Big 12 second team on the defensive line for Kansas. The headliners for KU, of course, Kobe Bryant and Melo Dotson, both on the all Big 12 first team. That's pretty impressive when you talk about two guys that were preseason first team all Big 12 and then really essentially, followed through on that and both end up on first team all Big 12 on the defensive side as well to end the season and the postseason. The other big name is Jared Casey. Jared Casey, all Big 12 first team.
All Big 12, yeah.
All Big 12 first team. Before anybody freaks out, which I know some people already have, he's all Big 12 first team fullback, not tight end. So basically, we've seen Jared Casey over the course of his career be utilized as sort of like an H-back, be utilized as sort of like a fullback type guy. And he gets all Big 12 first team at the fullback position. Kevin, I got to be honest, I don't think I could name another player in the Big 12 that is a fullback. Like, I don't know if there's anybody else in the Big 12 that even would be like eligible.
K-State has kind of a similar situation where they've got, like 4 tight ends, one of whom is kind of nominally a fullback. But yeah, it's not super common, obviously. And beyond not being super common, Kansas uses Jared Casey quite a bit more than somebody else, not just, as a guy to potentially catch the ball, but also as somebody to sort of set the point of attack in the running game, and they have for a few years. The funny thing is, I thought a couple of years ago Jared Casey got robbed, and he really had a terrific year. Really had a terrific year blocking that year. If you remember back to 2022, in 2021 he caught the pass against Texas to beat Texas. The next year, when KU started running the option in 2022 to kind of shock a lot of people across the Big 12, I thought Jared Casey played a really big role that year, was a point of attack guy, as a blocker. So many big plays that year you looked at and you said, well, hey, there's Jared Casey throwing the lead block. I thought he kind of got robbed that year. He does get a first team pick this year. So congratulations to the Plainville Assassin. That's awesome.
The other thing that is really noteworthy from the All Big 12 announcements is the lack of one certain individual, and that would be one Devin Neal, who was snubbed again off of both the first team and second team All Big 12. He did make honorable mention along with about half the other league. I don't know if you looked at this honorable mention list, Kevin. It's like, it's honorable mention. Everybody gets honorable mention. It's like, what's the point of it? There's 100 players.
I am mad at Coach Prime because Devin Neal's sophomore year, he went off against Oklahoma State, and Mike Gundy, I'm pretty sure, gave him a vote for Big 12 Offensive Player of the Year. So I want to know who Coach Prime picked that was better against them than Devin Neal was, because obviously Devin just absolutely controlled that game.
Yeah, for Offensive Player of the Year, it was Shedeur Sanders. For Defensive Player of the Year, it was Travis Hunter.
Coaches can't vote for their own guys. So, yeah. So for those guys.
We'll see who got the vote there. Coach of the Year was Kenny Dillingham for Arizona State. I think pretty well deserved. Jalen Daniels, by the way, was the Scholar Athlete of the Year, or one of two Scholar Athletes of the Year for KU as well. But yeah, back to this running back conversation. On the first team, you had Cam Scottaboo, which it's hard to gripe with that because he was very good this year. Obviously, one of the main reasons why Arizona State had the year they did have in terms of them making the Big 12 title game. So you can't really gripe with that. RJ Harvey was the other guy on the first team from UCF, which Kansas didn't play UCF this year, obviously. So that's, I don't know. And then you go to second team, Taj Brooks, who, of course, was the guy that was named to the first team in the preseason ahead of Devin Neal from Texas Tech. And then the one,
Taj, I thought, had a first team All Big 12 season. There were just three guys that basically did, along with RJ Harvey, who had all the numbers you could possibly want. And Cam Scottaboo, you had to pick him. I mean, Arizona State probably isn't in the Big 12 title game without, looking back at Cam Scottaboo and saying, run him till the wheels fall off.
But then the one that is a real head scratcher is the second running back on the second team, which is DJ Giddens of Kansas State over Devin Neal. That's the one that doesn't make a lot of sense. Kevin, you pointed out that you're pretty sure Devin Neal had more touchdowns in Big 12 play only than DJ Giddens had the whole season. DJ Giddens obviously is a talented running back, but if you look at DJ Giddens' stats, basically since after the Colorado game, he really, really fell off. I know against Iowa State, he had like one big run that made his stats look a lot better than maybe what they actually were. But that's pretty bad. I mean, listen, I don't really, obviously we are biased here on the show, but from a non-biased perspective, I'm not really sure how you could watch the Big 12 and watch Devin Neal and think that he is not one of the top four running backs in the conference.
Yeah, I think when you look at Kansas having the best offense in the conference from a yards per play standpoint,
who do you think played a big factor in that?
I think that you had to look at it and say, well, the biggest reason that Kansas did was the running game with Devin Neal, and so I do think that Devin Neal certainly deserved better than honorable mention. It was DJ Giddens is a really good back. He didn't find the end zone a ton this year. I think he scored 7 touchdowns, had an 8th, I think, in the passing game. Devin Neal, was it 16 that he had?
I believe so, yes.
So yeah, Devin Neal had he had 16 rushing touchdowns and had a 17th as a receiver. And so Giddens did have a few more yards per game than Devin Neal did, but Devin Neal had basically twice as many touchdowns. And so when you look at that part, when you look at the fact that Devin, I'm not sure, was really shut down in any single game in Big 12 play. The BYU game, I think he was at 3.7 yards per carry, but Nick, he scored both touchdowns and upset BYU. And so, and that was his worst game of the year, was, 3.7 yards per carry, but scoring 2 touchdowns. And so I do think that when you look at all of that and the consistency that Devin Neal had game after game after game after game, it's really hard to see him not being at least a second team selection.
Kansas did also have 3 offensive linemen on the second team: Logan Brown, Michael Ford Jr., and Bryce Foster. We talked about Logan Brown earlier in the show declaring for the NFL. Bryce Foster could come back. He also could potentially decide to try to test the NFL as well. You lose Michael Ford. So as of right now, if you're Kansas, you're losing guaranteed 2 starters off your offensive line, potentially 3 with Bryce Foster, who certainly has a decision to make potentially this offseason as well. And I'm looking here on defense. We mentioned Dean Miller. I think that was the only second team pick for Kansas on the defensive side. So that pretty much is it. Wraps it up for the list, right? On the first team, you got Melo Dotson, Kobe Bryant, both certainly well-deserved, along with Jared Casey. Second team, on offense, the 3 offensive linemen, Brown, Ford, and Foster, and then Dean Miller on defense, with Devin Neal being snubbed off the list there for Kansas. So, Kevin, I think that's going to wrap up the show. We packed a lot into today's show, so both on the football and basketball side. So be sure to like, subscribe. We're going to be talking more. Certainly, we're going to be talking KU and Missouri coming up early next week after they play on Sunday afternoon, and then we really start. I mean, we're already in transfer portal season, but it really starts to kick off big time next week, with it really getting opened up and Kansas looking at their options, obviously, in terms of players they could get out of the portal, and then obviously looking at players on the roster for KU that you hope KU can retain, but may lose as well, with DJ Warner obviously being the biggest one on Tuesday. So, Kevin, any final thoughts before we wrap the show here?
No, I do think, we talked about one rivalry game, Nick. If you're into another rivalry, I do know a pretty good Christmas gift, I think, that's sitting out there.
What's that? Oh, right. Yeah, we did. I forgot to talk about that. Missouri and Kansas, of course, are playing on Sunday in a big rivalry in the border war. Obviously, the other rival for Kansas is the K-State Wildcats, the Sunflower Showdown. And one of our friend of the show, Mike Vernon, has published a book, actually, compiling the entire list of all of K-State's national championships in the history of their program. So if you've got a friend who's a K-State fan, it's a great stocking stuffer. You can find it on Amazon, looking up the compilation of all of K-State's national championships over the course of their long and illustrious history of national titles. Good for
terrific in-depth research by Vernon on this one. So
it's over 100 pages of research, over 100 pages of content in the book. So shout out to Mike Vernon for putting that together. And it's, again, makes a great stocking stuffer for if you've got anybody who's a K-State fan, which I think, if you're a KU fan, you probably know at least one K-State fan. So there you go. Get them that for Christmas. You can find that on Amazon as well. So be sure to check that out. And shout out to Mike Vernon as well. Okay. Thank you, Kevin, for reminding me of that, because otherwise I would have forgot. Now we're actually going to wrap the show here on the Paid Podcast. Once again, if you like what you listen to, you can subscribe. If you liked what you watch, if you're joining us on YouTube, be sure to comment, subscribe, like the show, as well as always, spread the word about us. And we'll be back again very soon, talking KU Missouri, talking KU transfer portal, and all things happening in the world of KU athletics. One other quick note is also on Friday. Also, I kept thinking today's Tuesday. Today's Thursday. On Friday, by the way, KU volleyball will be kicking off in the NCAA tournament. So be sure to go out and support. I know they already sold out earlier in the week, all of the tickets, which is pretty cool as well. So that's pretty awesome also. So we may be talking about a little bit that as well. All right. Until then, He's Kevin Flaherty. I'm Nick Springer, and we'll talk to you again soon. See ya.